The Labrador isn't from Labrador like we all have been told. The dog that would go on to become the most popular breed on the planet, the one curled up under desks in offices, sniffing out explosives at airports, guiding the blind through traffic, actually comes from the other side of the map entirely, from the freezing, rocky coastline of Newfoundland. The story of how it got its name, how it nearly vanished completely, and how a handful of British aristocrats basically gambled the breed's existence on a single litter of puppies, is a lot stranger than the dog's reputation for being easygoing would suggest. Start with the fishermen. Newfoundland in the 16 and 1700s was brutal. Cold water, short summers, a cod fishery that ran on hard labor and not much else. Settlers there, many originally from Devon in England, needed a dog that could do a very specific, very physical job. Jump off the side of a small boat called a dory, swim out into the freezing Atlantic, grab a fish that had slipped off a hook or line, and haul it back without complaint. Not a pet, a tool. The dog had to be a strong swimmer, small enough to fit in a working fisherman's dory, and just as importantly, it needed the temperament to be a companion through long, isolated winters where a man and his dog might be each other's only company for months on end. What developed out of that environment was a tough, compact, oily-coated black dog the locals called the St. John's Water Dog, named after the colonial capital. This dog was good at its job, almost unnervingly so. Fishermen preferred the short-haired ones because ice didn't accumulate on their water-resistant coats, which meant they could keep working in conditions that would have a long-haired dog dragging frozen clumps of fur within minutes. An Irish dog authority, writing in 1847, described watching one of these dogs dive repeatedly to the bottom of a canal to retrieve stones thrown in, purely, it seemed, because it enjoyed the work. That's the temperament baked into the breed from day one. A dog that doesn't just tolerate hard physical labor, it actively craves it. Here's where the geography gets confusing, because Newfoundland is also home to another famous breed, the actual Newfoundland, the giant, shaggy water rescue dog you might picture pulling a child from a river. For a long time, these two breeds were mixed up constantly, even by people writing entire books about dogs. The truth is, they share the same rootstock. Some St. John's dogs were bred larger to handle strenuous outport tasks, like hauling wood and pulling sleighs, and were later crossed with European Mastiffs to get the broad heads and heavy builds we recognize today. Those became the Newfoundland. The smaller, leaner dogs stayed on as working fishing companions, and it's those dogs that eventually caught the attention of English nobility. That happened almost by accident, through a trade route. Newfoundland fishing ships loaded with salted cod regularly docked at Poole on the southern English coast, and the sailors brought their dogs along for the crossing. Once in port, they'd have their dogs perform for crowds, retrieving objects thrown into the water, basically free advertising for an extremely capable working animal. British aristocrats with shooting estates were paying attention because a dog this good at retrieving from water was exactly what they needed for waterfowl hunting. By the 1830s, the 10th Earl of Home and his nephews, the 5th Duke of Buccleuch and Lord John Scott, were importing these dogs from Newfoundland specifically to use as gun dogs, and the 2nd Earl of Malmesbury was doing the same, breeding them purely for their skill at waterfowling. It's Malmesbury who's credited with sticking the name Labrador onto the breed, even though the dogs had nothing to do with the Labrador region whatsoever. The most likely explanation is that he simply borrowed the name of the nearby coastline to distinguish his hunting dogs from the much bigger Newfoundland breed, which already had that name firmly locked down. Some historians think it might also trace back to the Portuguese word for labourer. Given how many Portuguese fishermen had worked that same coastline for centuries before the English arrived. Nobody really agrees on the exact reasoning, but the name stuck. And that's the label that travelled forward through history, while the actual origin quietly got forgotten by almost everyone outside Newfoundland itself. Then, things back home turned grim. Through the 1800s, colonial authorities slapped heavy taxes and ownership restrictions on dogs, partly to encourage sheep farming on the island. Households that could only afford to keep one animal tended to keep a working male rather than a breeding female. And that's effectively a death sentence for a bloodline. Fewer females means fewer puppies, which means a shrinking gene pool with every passing generation. Add Britain's strict rabies quarantine laws introduced in 1885, which made importing dogs from Newfoundland a serious legal hassle. And the supply line from Canada essentially dried up within a single generation. It's a strange thing to think about. The exact policies meant to protect British livestock from disease ended up sealing off the very source population that had created one of Britain's most beloved breeds. Which meant that by the late 1800s, the entire future of this dog rested on a small, closed circle of British breeders, working with whatever stock they already had on their own estates. In the 1880s, the 3rd Earl of Malmesbury, the 6th Duke of Buccleuch, and the 12th Earl of Home pulled their bloodlines together in a coordinated effort to keep the type alive. Two dogs in particular, named Buccleuch Avon and Buccleuch Ned, gifted by Malmesbury to the Duke, were paired with females descended from the original Newfoundland imports, and their offspring became, quite literally, the ancestors of every Labrador alive today. Every single one. That's not a metaphor. It's a direct genetic line traced back to that handful of estate dogs in Scotland and southern England. Meanwhile, back on Newfoundland's coast, the original St. John's water dog kept fading. The very last of them were two males living in a remote outport called Grand Bret on the island's south coast, and they died sometime in the 1980s. There's something genuinely strange about that timeline. The dog that founded one of the most successful breeds in the world went extinct in its actual homeland within living memory, while its British descendants were already winning dog shows and starring in advertisements on the other side of the Atlantic, completely oblivious to what was happening back where it all began. The breed got official recognition from the Kennel Club in England in 1903, and the American Kennel Club followed in 1917. Coat colours we now consider classic, like chocolate and yellow, weren't valued at all in the early years. Black was the only colour anyone really cared about, partly because it was easier to spot against open ground while out shooting waterfowl. The other colours kept turning up anyway, products of recessive genes hiding quietly in that small founding population, and eventually breeders stopped fighting it and just embraced them, which is how we ended up with the 3 official colours recognised in show rings and back gardens today. So that's the Ark, a fisherman's working tool, bred for raw function in brutal conditions, exported almost by accident through a cod trade route, rescued from near-total collapse by a tiny circle of aristocrats with shooting estates, and now sitting in millions of living rooms worldwide, named after a place it never actually came from. The next time a Labrador drops a soggy tennis ball in your lap and stares at you expectantly, waiting for you to throw it again, remember that's 300 years of icy Atlantic fishing instinct looking back at you, just waiting for something to retrieve.